You feel a slight fever and a bit of a headache. It seems like the kind of exhaustion that a good night's sleep will fix. You take a paracetamol and climb into bed, assuming it's the flu. But in less than 48 hours, your lungs are filling with fluid. You are drowning on dry land. In the spring of 1993, this happened to a healthy Navajo man in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest. He suddenly collapsed and died. His fiancée developed the same symptoms at his funeral and died shortly after. Panic erupted as the invisible killer spread, infecting 33 people in the remote area. Of those 33 people, 17 were dead within weeks. These were young, active adults whose immune systems offered no protection against a pathogen that medicine could not yet name, let alone treat. The killer was invisible, rapid, and brutally efficient. Teams from the CDC identified the carrier, the deer mouse. This tiny creature hosted a virus never before recorded in the Americas. Native American elders, fearing a permanent stigma on their sacred land, successfully argued against naming it after the local geography. Instead, it was called sin nombre, Spanish for the virus without a name. But the virus wasn't new. In 1951, during the Korean War, more than 3,000 United Nations troops fell ill with high fevers and mysterious kidney failure. Many began bleeding internally. At the time, medics could only call it Korean hemorrhagic fever, and they watched as the mortality rate climbed to 12%. In 1976, South Korean researcher Dr. Lee Ho-wong isolated the virus from the lung tissue of a striped field mouse near the Hantaan River. He named it the Hantavirus, finally providing a scientific identity to the family of pathogens that had haunted the peninsula for decades. These viruses have lived silently inside rodents across the planet for centuries. We are not dealing with a modern anomaly, but an ancient, lethal roommate that has shared our environment since long before we had the tools to see it. Scientists divide hantaviruses into two distinct camps based on how they attack the body. Old World hantaviruses, found across Asia and Europe, typically target the kidneys. New World hantaviruses, like the strain found in the Four Corners, attack the lungs, leading to hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, or HPS. This is made possible by a biological pact. The virus doesn't make the rodent sick. A mouse or rat lives a perfectly healthy life while constantly shedding the virus in its urine, saliva, and droppings. When these waste products dry out, they turn into dust. A broom sweeping a floor, or even a simple footstep can disturb that dust, sending microscopic viral particles floating into the air. A single breath is all it takes to invite the killer into your lungs. This mechanism weaponizes the most mundane domestic chores. A gust of wind through a shed or a morning spent cleaning an attic becomes a potentially fatal exposure. In March 2023, a Canadian man named Lorne Warburton went to his attic to shake out a dusty rug. It was a simple household chore, but that rug was contaminated with particles of dried mouse urine. 3 days later, he was hit with body aches and crushing fatigue. His lungs began to fail, and he was rushed to the hospital and put on life support. He described the 3 weeks he spent fighting for every breath as hell on earth. Lorne survived, but his story is a reminder that the virus does not discriminate. It doesn't require a war zone or a remote desert. It can transform a person's own home into a biological hazard. In April 2026, the Dutch cruise ship MV Hondius set sail with 150 passengers. Somewhere during an excursion, perhaps at a garbage dump near the docks, an invisible passenger boarded the vessel. Days into the journey, a 70-year-old passenger died of a suspected stomach bug. Then his wife died. When a third passenger fell ill, panic began to ripple through the ship. They were in the middle of the ocean with no way to escape the source of the infection. Tests later confirmed it was the Andes virus. This discovery was catastrophic because the Andes strain is the only hantavirus known to spread from human to human. The WHO declared an international emergency, but the timing was a disaster. Passengers had already disembarked and flown home to 12 different countries across 4 continents. A localized outbreak had effectively been globalized by the speed of modern travel. Our own wanderlust and mobility served as the vehicle for the virus, turning a ship's isolated tragedy into a borderless tracing race for health officials worldwide. With potential carriers now scattered across multiple countries, the focus shifted to the risk of a person-to-person chain reaction. Health officials needed to determine if a single infected individual in a crowded airport or supermarket could trigger a new pandemic. This comes down to the reproduction number, or R0. For COVID-19, that number was between 2 and 3, allowing it to spread exponentially. For Hantavirus, the R0 is significantly below 1. Because the transmission rate is below 1, the virus sputters and dies out. It requires a very specific, unlucky set of circumstances to jump between humans, meaning the risk to the general population remains extremely low. This is not the next global pandemic, but the personal stakes remain devastating. While the virus doesn't spread easily, those who do inhale contaminated dust face a case fatality rate between 30 and 50%. For the individual, it is a toss-up between survival and drowning. Hantavirus is a biological paradox. It lacks the transmission speed to shut down the world, but it remains a catastrophic game of Russian roulette for anyone who disturbs the... A broom sweeping a floor, a footstep in an attic, even a gust of wind, that is all it takes to disturb microscopic particles of dried rodent waste, sending them floating into the air like a toxic cloud. In March 2023, a Canadian man named Lorne Warburton went up to his attic to shake out a dusty rug, fighting off rapid lung failure. He was suffering from Hantavirus. The mechanics of this infection are brutally simple. The pathogen concentrates in rodent urine, droppings, and saliva. When those fluids dry out, the virus waits in the dust. You inhale it, and it enters your system directly. The primary carrier in North America is the deer mouse. It lives a perfectly healthy life, building nests and scurrying around, entirely unaffected by the pathogen it constantly sheds. That is the terrifying paradox of this pathogen. A virus that is completely harmless to a tiny mouse becomes a lethal drowning machine the moment a human takes a single breath. To see how lethal, we have to look at the spring of 1993, in the desolate Four Corners region of the American Southwest. A young, healthy Navajo man collapsed with his lungs filled with fluid. Hours later, he was dead. His fiancée soon developed the exact same symptoms and died. Disease detectives from the CDC descended on the area to find a source of the outbreak. They traced the killer back to the deer mouse, ultimately naming the pathogen sin nombre, the virus without a name. It infected 33 people and killed 17. But this invisible killer is far older than the 1993 outbreak, and tracking its origins requires tracing medical records halfway across the globe. During the Korean War in 1951, thousands of United Nations soldiers fighting in freezing, harsh conditions began falling ill with a mysterious hemorrhagic fever. They suffered internal bleeding and severe kidney failure, with mortality rates reaching 12% in some units. It took nearly 25 years to find the culprit. In 1976, South Korean researcher Dr. Lee Ho Wang isolated the pathogen from a striped field mouse near the Hantaan River, officially naming it the Hantaan virus. This map illustrates how the virus family splits geographically. In the Old World, across Asia, Europe, and Africa, these hantaviruses typically attack the kidneys. Over in the New World of the Americas, they attack the lungs. For decades, humanity managed to survive these highly lethal, localized outbreaks. The virus required direct contact with local rodent populations, keeping the casualties contained. But modern travel removes that isolation. In April 2026, the Dutch-flagged cruise ship MV Hondius departed Argentina for a bucket list journey to Antarctica. During a shore excursion near a garbage dump, several passengers inhaled silent, invisible dust particles left by local rodents. Days later, far out on the open ocean, the horror began. A 70-year-old Dutch man developed a fever and rapidly died. Soon after, his wife passed away. Then a German woman fell ill and died. Panic ripped through the isolated vessel. A test result revealed a nightmare scenario. The passengers were infected with the Andes virus. Found in Argentina and Chile, this specific strain is the only known hantavirus capable of spreading from human to human. The World Health Organization immediately declared an international emergency. A human-transmissible strain of a highly lethal pathogen spreading through the close quarters of a cruise ship is a severe epidemiological threat. Look at how quickly the threat scales on this map. Before the alarm was raised, dozens of potentially exposed passengers had already disembarked early at the remote island of St. Helena. They got on planes and flew home to 12 different countries across 4 continents. These individuals vanished into the general populations of the UK, the US, Singapore, and beyond. Global health officials were forced into a desperate race to trace every contact before they could trigger a chain reaction. Which forces the obvious question: has an ancient, localized pathogen finally hijacked our transit network to start a global airborne pandemic? The short answer is no. You cannot catch this virus from a cough or a sneeze while standing in line at the supermarket. The basic reproduction number, or R0, tells us how many people one sick person will infect. COVID-19's R0 was around 3, spreading exponentially. Hantavirus sits significantly below 1. Because human-to-human transmission is so low, its chain of infection quickly sputters out and dies. But a low global risk does not mean a low personal risk. For the specific individual who breathes in that contaminated dust, it is a game of Russian roulette. The case fatality rate ranges from 30 to 50%. You have a nearly 1 in 2 chance of dying from lung failure. Because human infection requires such highly specific environmental triggers, the power to protect yourself is entirely in your own hands. This infographic shows the golden rule of rodent cleanup. Never dry sweep or vacuum an enclosed space like a shed or attic. Doing so launches the pathogen into the air. Instead, thoroughly spray the area with a wet disinfectant to trap the particles on the ground. Hantavirus is a brutal, unforgiving illness, but by understanding its ecological boundaries and treating dusty, enclosed spaces with respect, we can neutralize the threat before we ever